Next, new for tonight, but I do provide this on an annual basis, is our financial projections for the board. To make projections, we need to enter information or assumptions in order to kind of project out several years. So many of these assumptions have not changed from previous years. Certainly we make small tweaks here and there. But I'd like to take a minute and highlight some of the bigger assumptions first before we jump into the actual projections. So this is on the board book, page 33, I believe.
Hold on till Marianne gets there. Yeah, there? Okay.
Yeah,
She's there.
she's on.
Okay. So under revenue, property tax collection continues to be held at 99% for these assumptions. Corporate property taxes, currently this year we're projected to receive $400,000. In the projections for fiscal year 21 through 24, I did decrease those to $375 because that reflects a 3-year historical average, which has been our practice in the past.
So that's the corporate taxes that we're receiving are going down.
Well, I just put in a 3-year average. We don't get that actual number or projection until August of each year. So traditionally, our practice has been for these assumptions to do a 3-year historical average. So last year, that number was lower in the projections because this year we got more money. 400 is on the high end of what we've received in the past.
Okay.
Consumer Price Index, CPI, for levy year 2020, I put in 2.3%, as that is what we know it will be. And then I left it at 2% for the levy years, fiscal year 21 through 24. That's something that we have done in the past as well. Evidence-based funding, I increased by 1% for fiscal year 21 and 22, and then held flat for 23 and 24. There are some more recent concerns about evidence-based funding and the state being able to properly fund that moving forward. But for right now, I held it flat for the most part.
So I just want to interject on this. I think that's a really important point. The governor released a budget with 2 different scenarios, and one of them really does decimate evidence-based funding. So we should be aware of the possible negative impact on that for us.
Yeah, should that graduated income tax not pass,
Yes,
that's going to be decimated.
absolutely. This is a very real risk, I think.
Yeah, I think there certainly always has been a concern from schools as to whether or not evidence-based funding was really sustainable, especially being funded at 100%, which is something the state hasn't done in a long time.
I just think people should know
Yeah.
the fact that he submitted 2 budgets.
Yes.
It should be eye-opening for everyone.
Absolutely.
We're not getting the money.
And then EAV new construction, our 3-year average has been roughly $2 million. So I put that in as an assumption. And then student fees and state payments right now have been held consistent. Under expenditures, there are a lot of assumptions. The big ones are always related to staffing as well as benefits. So under staff salaries, this part can be a little misleading because there's 2 different sections where I enter in assumptions. So certified staff is increasing, salaries is increasing at 3.78% for next year. That's due in part from a teacher returning from a leave. The sub was half the cost of the teacher that is coming back, but also that doesn't account for the retirement savings because I have to enter that at a different part in the model. And so that's where some of this can be a little misleading. And so fiscal year 22 is set to increase by 3.5%, and 23 and 24 I put at 3.4%. So I used our current contract as much as I could and then just kind of projected out for the future. Administrative contracts are...
So quick question, I'm sorry. Does the 22, 23, and 24, does that take into account also the retirement savings and the any other teacher activity that we know of, or are those straight from the CBA?
So that is straight from kind of CBA and what I know about staffing right now. The retirement piece comes down 4 lines later.
Okay.
And those savings range anywhere from $93,000 to $278,000, depending on the year in which we're talking about and the number of teachers that are retiring.
Okay.
Also, staffing and hiring projections, which are based off of enrollment projections, get factored into this, at a different point in the model. So, for example, next year I have in the model that will be decreasing 1 FTE, holding flat for 23 and 22, and then in 24 decreasing by 0.6 as well.
That's just based on our enrollment.
Correct, that's just based on our enrollment. And then right now, medical insurance increasing at 5.25% and dental at 1.5%. We'll get those actual rates for next year next week. So for right now, it's just based off the estimates that I've received.
And then anything over what, a 5% increase is split 50-50?
Correct, with the union,
With the union.
the employees and the district, correct.
Medical trend is closer to 6.5 right now, so that's pretty.
We're in a
The cooperative has
self-funded,
helped-
right?
No, we're in a big
No.
cooperative that's helped
Cooperative.
keep our premiums low.
Yes, and we've been fortunate where we've not been hitting that 6% increase in the past 4 or 5 years. Other things, supplies and materials increase at 1%. And then it's important to note that when I show you the projections in a minute, that we also always have the 2 lines because we take out the $2.9 million that's reserved in working cash for the field acquisition. So moving on to page 34, these are our projections, and it can be a little overwhelming at first. Just want to walk you through a few things. The first column on the left is in black, and that's our current budget. So if you can go down to the yellow line, you'll see that the expected deficit for this year is $402,000. That is considering that we get 100% of our revenues and 100% of our expenditures. That I don't think has ever happened. So I do anticipate the deficit coming in a little lower than 400 for this year. If you drop down to the second yellow band, you'll see the fund balance without the $2 million that's reserved in working cash, and then the fund balance as a percent of expenditures, and then below that, the fund balance as a number of months to expend. So you can see that, at the end of this year, assuming we finish with a $400,000 deficit, our fund balance would be at 48%. So then we project out over the next 4 years, and in fiscal 21, you can see we're projecting a deficit of $640,816. My job over the next couple of months then is to get that down as low as I can and kind of scrub the budget. So hopefully we won't end with a deficit of 640 when I present the budget to you, but that's where we're at about right now. So as you can see, as you go through each year, we are anticipating a deficit each fiscal year for the next 4 years. And if you look at the bottom right corner in fiscal year 24, you'll see if we continue to spend down, we will be at a fund balance of 37% with roughly a little over 4.5 months to operate.
And a $1 million deficit?
Yeah, so the reason that is because we have some debt. There's some bonds coming off the books in fiscal year 23, and it's a timing issue. We get the revenue in 23, but then we have to finish paying it out in 24. So that's why you can see the revenue is so high in that year as well. So it's really a timing issue.
There's nothing you can do to impact that.
No.
I mean, obviously, we have whatever our expenditure, our traditional expenditure and revenue, but a big chunk of that is the final debt payment.
Correct.
So it
Okay.
diminishes in 25,
Correct.
Correct.
but it's still a deficit, to be clear.
Yes.
Right, and I kept looking at it because all the rest of the numbers seem very similar in all the columns. So I was like, how do we go from 105 to a million? Right,
And that's why
the answer.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, especially if you look at the revenue percentage, you're in 23, you're increasing a little over 3%, and then in 24 you have a decrease in revenue, and that's because of that.
Because of that payment.
Gotcha.
And so a couple things the board needs to understand. This is done in March before we even do the budget. So these are projections as we went through at length with the Finance Advisory Council. Things will change. When Kristen did this projection last year with the board and while we were doing negotiations, we were hovering around 6. Then all of a sudden in May, maybe a teacher requests a leave of absence. Okay, so now you go from maybe a higher salary to a year 1 salary. There's savings there. You get interest income you weren't expecting on. from the township treasurer on our money that's in our fund balances. Like, you can only project so much of that. You can only guess so much of that. So the goal is obviously to have a budget has a deficit of less than 640. But we use the next 3 or 4 months now to determine that. So this is kind of like worst case scenario, right? But I would think, and this is something that always gets discussed, the board would rather see worst case scenario and have it finish better than have, oh, we're only going to have we're going to be at a surplus, or we're going to be at a small deficit, and then we come in at $500,000 deficit. You'd be like, what the heck is going on? So I'm preparing you for that. This is like worst case scenario. It should end up being better once we figure out staffing, if we figure out if there's other things information that comes in later from the township treasurer's office. All that kind of gets worked into this, and that's how we get the actual budget to be lower than the projections. It could go the other way. If the state doesn't finance evidence-based funding, there could be an impact.
I didn't want to bring that up again, but that seems.
Correct. It could go either way.
Because again, it's
But this
1%
should
and
be-
then flat, so
right.
that's a big assumption.
This should be worst-case scenario.
What would also happen if we, in addition to not funding evidence-based, and also got retirement?
A cost shift?
Yeah, or they shift
If
the
you
pension
did a cost shift,
burden.
obviously this would go up significantly. That doesn't take into effect. So if you lost revenue like evidence-based funding and you got the cost shift, obviously your expenditures would increase and your revenues would decline. The overall deficit would increase. Now, on a regular basis, I will tell you that I get this every year at the superintendent meetings. They always say that somewhere down the line, they're going to tie fully funding evidence-based. I mean, it's almost like routine. We get the same message at the superintendent conference annually. It has not happened for 4 or 5 years, that they're going to eventually tie fully funding evidence-based funding to a gradual cost shift in pension. And they've tried to propose that in the past, and it's never made it out of committee, or it's never made it through the, both branches, but or both houses, I should say, but that's the threat that continually is proposed to the superintendents. That if they're going to fully fund, that the legislators approve this whole evidence-based funding model. Because it's an aggressive approach. Every year they're supposed to add like $200 million on to what they paid the previous year to continue to fund underfunded schools and to keep schools whole. And so that's why I think he did 2 budgets, one with his progressive income tax, and then one without, because he's trying to hold that over us now, right? And so you could already see how evidence-based funding is being used as a political tool, like, hey, support me here if you want this, right? So that's been the other thing that they've been preparing us for at the state level, is trying to tie some type of cost shift into fully funding the evidence-based model, which it was never intended to do, but
We received roughly $2 million this year in evidence-based funding.
Well, I think there's a lot of focus on what the property tax system looks like, right? That's where all of this is tracking together, whether it's cost shift, whether it's evidence-based funding, whether it's the tax on the ballot in the fall. So I think it's something just obviously to keep abreast of. And it's some real shifting sands. Nothing will happen immediately. It's not like on June 30th, someone has to absorb it. But I do think it's something to certainly be mindful of and budget somewhat conservatively as a result of it. That's my thought.
We're in a reassessment cycle again, so attorneys are being very aggressive. I know in Brookfield, we've all gotten mail to start now to contest increases to property taxes. Because we will be reassessed as, not for the coming year, but for the next year.
correct, the triennial.
So that too could impact.
Yeah, I think, the important thing though is, this shows you we should have 3 years of stability at least, hopefully 4. And it just goes back to Kristen's financial report, which is reality, right? We overspent by $3 million this month. And so that's where you tap into that fund balance. So if you spend that down and you need the $3 million, you don't have the $3 million, you take out like a payday loan, a tax anticipation warrant to pay your bills for that month until your next set of property taxes come in. That's like the worst thing you could do as a school. So that's why it's important you try to keep at least 3 months on the books untouched.
And we had to do that once, when the funds were held.
Correct.
We had to borrow money to make payroll.
Okay, Kirsten, anything else on the projections?
No.
Where are we trending in that green box? Did you touch on that, the little green footnote?
The green box is just a summary of exactly what you just said, that right, currently we're, overspending by 3 million, and that's because we haven't received our spring property tax yet. So I can't necessarily right now project whether or not we're gonna hit the $400,000 deficit for this year or not. I do think we'll come under that, but to what extent, I can't project until we really get a full picture of our revenue and closer to our expenditures. So probably at the April meeting, I'll have much more, hopefully, a much better accurate picture of where we should finish the year at.
Okay, and there were no questions submitted on this?
Correct.
Okay. Good job.